probably don't need to tell you, given that you've clicked on this episode, but depression is not just a mood state, even though it's often used in that context. It is a global health crisis. So right now, more than 320 million people worldwide are living with major depressive disorder. And by 2030, depression is projected to account for 13% of the global burden of disease. So we're talking like disability, loss of quality of life, increased physical illness, and of course, like the potential of suicide. It places enormous strain on families, enormous strain on healthcare systems, workplaces, but most of all, it places huge strain on the person who wakes up each day inside of it, negotiating a nervous system that has lost its ability to regulate energy, motivation, and of course, like that feeling of hope. Now, our current treatments that we have, they help, but not really enough, and definitely not for everyone. So if you take something like psychotherapy alone, it only brings remission for around half of those who engage with it. Medications, they can be life-saving, but they do come with side effects, right? And they also come with withdrawal symptoms, financial barriers, that's huge, and then really high relapse rates. There's also this like really confronting truth that 2/3 of adults with depression will never ever receive adequate treatment at all. So the question really becomes like, what else? What else is going to be able to support people living with major depressive disorder or MDD? What's going to do it safely? What's going to do it in an accessible way? And really, what's going to be effective? And that is where exercise enters the clinical chat. And I say this not as a sort of motivational slogan, not as a magical cure, obviously, but as a legitimate evidence-based adjunct therapy. So we have a bunch of like large prospective studies that show that people who are physically active, they're significantly less likely to develop depression. But there can be a number of reasons for that, right? We also have meta-analyses though that reveal that movement can reduce depressive symptoms in people that are already diagnosed with MDD. But until recently, the research has been kind of messy and inconsistent, right? We've had different types of exercise, different types of intensities, different program structures, and because of that, wildly different conclusions. So some of the studies were arguing that aerobic exercise was best, others were championing resistance training, some show that mind-body practices outperform both of them, and also very few of them were examining the dose, the actual energy expenditure required to create a meaningful therapeutic shift. And that's why the paper that we're exploring today is important. For those of you that are just listening and not watching, that was me like shaking the paper. I've got it right in front of me so I can refer to it. So basically this study is a network meta-analysis, which means it compares several exercise modalities across multiple randomized controlled trials at the same time. And it also uses something called a Bayesian model, which allows researchers to map a dose response curve even when individual trials differ in their protocols. So it's basically a way of us capturing this like very complex data more coherently than you would with traditional methods. And don't worry, if you're not sure what that means, I'm going to unpack that in a little bit more detail so that we have a really clear, robust understanding of what this paper is looking at. Now, this paper does not identify why exercise works. Like the biological and psychological mechanisms kind of still remain an open question. But what it does give us is far more practical, right? It gives us a clearer picture of which exercise modalities are going to help with major depressive disorder. And then, of course, I love this bit, how much exercise actually is therapeutically meaningful. Is there a sort of optimal dose? And just as a spoiler alert for this introduction, there absolutely is. And you'll probably be surprised to know, or maybe not, that it isn't endless. Okay, so more is not necessarily better. It actually shows what's called a U-shaped dose response curve, meaning that beyond a certain point, more exercise does not actually yield more benefit and maybe even can make things not very good. Okay, so there is a sweet spot. And I also find this very exciting. There is a minimum clinically meaningful dose that can genuinely still shift depressive symptoms. We love a minimum effective dose over here. This podcast is not about suggesting that exercise is a cure for depression, although I will say that many people in the Vertue Crew community would argue it feels like it is close to being a cure, especially when you combine it with psychological work. But I would definitely say at the right dose, approached in the right way, exercise, and I'm going to go even further to say training is a powerful intervention that can meaningfully change how someone experiences their day, their energy, and then ultimately, if something is meaningfully impacting your day over time accumulation, that means it's going to meaningfully impact your life. Whew. Welcome to the Vertue Podcast. If you're new here, extra welcome. If you've been here before, deep welcome and a deep thank you very much for returning. You already know that this is not your typical fitness or wellnessy podcast. What we explore on this show is this sort of living intersection between psychology and physiology. Two systems that I think, unfortunately, we often pretend exist separately, even though they are constantly shaping each other, right? Your thoughts, they change your hormones change your thoughts. Your beliefs, they affect your behavior it rewires your brain. So it's not mind versus body or mind body, it's actually mind as body and body as mind. For my musos out there, if you've ever watched a musician tune or listened to a musician tune one string, and then heard how the entire instrument shifts, that's what these systems are like. Yeah, you touch one and the whole thing, it resonates differently. And also there's this kind of third layer that I weave through the podcast, philosophy, sometimes spirituality, and then of course the social aspects and the social world that we're all kind of swimming in, right? And I keep this slightly separate from psychology because psychology explains the how, right? How we operate. But philosophy, I think it really helps us to understand why we operate the way we do, especially when life becomes heavy or complex. So together, they give us a much more complete view of human experience. So today's episode, it's going to bring all of these threads together, probably except for the philosophical, although we'll do a little bit, but there's so much to cover. Now, before we dive deeper, you know what we got to do? Well, if you're new here, you don't know what we're going to do next. But if you're not new, you know that now I'm going to take you through the roadmap. So let's do that. And that way, you know exactly where we're headed, and so that you can stay with me as we move from science to application to meaning. So first up, we're going to look at what clinical depression actually is. We're going to get those definitions out of the way, how major depressive disorder is actually defined, and how clinicians classify it. We're also going to talk about why it affects not just mood, but energy, behavior, cognition, and the body itself. Now, we talk about depression like it's a feeling, but clinically, it's really a full body syndrome. Then second, we're going to revisit the main treatment approaches: psychotherapy, medication, sometimes a combination, and the limitations that have really pushed researchers to search for this additional accessible intervention. Then we're going to unpack the paper at the heart of this episode, what the authors did, how they did it, what they found, and why those findings really matter for anyone whose life intersects with depression, which, I mean, to be honest, is kind of all of us, right? Now, to really understand how to use this research effectively, we have to talk about something called METs, what they are, how they're calculated, and why they give us such a useful way to understand exercise intensity across these different modalities. It's a super important part. It'll make sense. And after that, I'm going to translate the research into the part that you can actually use. Okay, and that's why those METs are important to understand. We're going to be talking about how much exercise produces the best response for depression, what the minimum effective dose is, because we love a minimum effective dose, and then how we can apply this in real, very imperfect life, okay? Particularly for those of you who are navigating low energy, low motivation, or really the heaviness of MDD. After that, I'm going to share my own recommendations, not just from the science, but actually from years and years of coaching people who have, for whatever reason, experienced these depressive periods or have been diagnosed with MDD, how they have stayed in alignment with their training, how we've worked through that. Evidence is one thing, lived experience is definitely another, and I think that being able to use that comes from the friction that often is seen in between the two. That's a little bit metaphorical, but you'll understand more what I'm talking about when we kind of go there. And so that's where we're heading today. That was a big roadmap. We have a lot to cover. Let's dive in. What is clinical depression? So, as I've already said, major depressive disorder is not simply sadness, right? It's a diagnosable condition with a very specific pattern: persistent low mood, loss of interest or loss of pleasure. We've got changes in sleep and appetite. We've also got impaired concentration, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, and sometimes suicidal thoughts. Obviously, there's also some cultural differences in the way that depression sort of manifests. Some cultures, some ethnicities experience it in a more physical way than they do in necessarily like feeling low in their mood or a negative thought. But it's a bigger thing than just being like, oh, I just feel a bit depressed, which is why I really feel like I have to specify that, because sometimes we throw the term around really loosely at times to try to describe and communicate how we feel. But it is a really serious and real thing that people experience that isn't fluctuating for many of these people that are experiencing this. Maybe that's even you. So it must be kind of frustrating if people are always talking about it in a sort of trivial way where they're like, oh yeah, I'm just a bit depressed today. Even though obviously there's no malintent there, but it's important to make a distinction. When classifying major depressive disorder and depression that is clinically recognized, these symptoms tend to last at least 2 weeks, but they often go on much, much, much longer. Now, clinically, depression is classified by severity. So we've got mild, we've got moderate, we've got severe, based on how many symptoms are present and how much they start to impair daily functioning. The important thing to know that I've already stressed is that depression is not this character deficit. It's not a motivational failure. It is a condition that affects your cognition, it affects your behavior, and it affects the body itself. So we've really impacting like our energy, our sensitivity, our decision-making pathways, like all of them are altered. And that's why doing things, even doing things that you want to do or once wanted to do, they become incredibly, incredibly hard. Now, traditionally, depression is treated with psychotherapy, with medication, or with both. Now, I'm going to very briefly go over these. I don't want this whole podcast to be about depression in and of itself, but actually the effects of training, different kinds of training on depression. But it's important to kind of cover the context of these. So obviously psychotherapy works, especially approaches like CBT and behavioral activation. I've talked about both of these, more so behavioral activation in an episode before. I also use BA techniques in my Vertue Method Express program because of how profound behavioral activation actually is. But the problem with using just these is that remission rates are around 50%. Now, when you combine it with medication, it's more effective, but the issue with medication is that it comes with side effects, right? It also comes with very high relapse rates. It also comes with withdrawal symptoms, and not everyone is able to afford medication. So we have these sort of effective tools in isolation, but none of them are universally effective. None of them are universally accessible or easy to stick with. And so this is very much why researchers are looking very seriously at exercise, not as this sort of replacement for these things, but as a meaningful part of the treatment landscape. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears slightly and talk about the paper, the research paper that's at the center of this episode. So the study that we're drawing from is called, it's a bit of a title, but anyway, you know what it's like in these spaces, Optimal Exercise Modality and Dose to Improve Depressive Symptoms in Adults with Major Depressive Disorder. It was led by Shudong Tian and colleagues. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Basically, they're a very multidisciplinary team working across public health, rehabilitation science, and mental health. And really, their aim was pretty ambitious, but incredibly practical. They were trying to figure out not just whether exercise helps major depression, but which types of exercise help the most and in what amounts. Because if exercise is going to sit alongside therapy and medication as a part of the treatment landscape, we really need much more than just vague recommendations like move more or exercise more. We need actual clarity. We need type, intensity, dose, the kind of clarity that clinicians, but even coaches and even individuals living with depression can actually start to act on. So to do this, the researchers used a much more advanced analytical method than much of the previous reviews. And they ran what's called a network meta-analysis. Now, for a recap, a traditional meta-analysis, it's amazing, but it only really compares treatments that were directly tested against each other. So we've got aerobic training versus control, or resistance training versus the control, right? Or no exercise, and so on. But when you take a network meta-analysis, it starts to build this web of evidence, and it allows you to compare aerobic versus resistance versus mind-body versus mixed training, even if no single trial that they were looking at compared all of those head-to-head. So it means you end up getting this much broader and realistic picture of how these modalities start to stack up in the real world. Now, they also used a Bayesian model, which is a much more flexible way of analyzing very complex data. So rather than forcing every study to fit into the same statistical assumptions, this Bayesian model, it actually starts to update estimates as new information enters. And it's a bit like how your brain learns, or at least how it's supposed to learn. I sometimes feel like I don't think my brain learns like that. I don't always remember to update information as I go on. I try to, but it doesn't always work that way. In an ideal world, our brain is very good at updating and acting in accordance with the new information, right? And so in exercise research, where studies differ wildly in intensity and duration in design, the Bayesian flexibility allows the model to estimate the patterns that really would be otherwise quite impossible to map. And it really does this to allow for the relationship between the dose and the response. So with this methodology, the authors were able to explore 3 really, really big questions. Which exercise modalities actually improve depressive symptoms? Love that. Is one type of exercise a little bit more effective than another? Also love this question. Is there an optimal dose of exercise for depression, including the minimum dose that still produces real clinical, meaningful improvement? And so, I think we need a drum roll. Here's what they found. This is really where it gets quite exciting, actually. So across all the trials, including aerobic exercise, resistance training, mind-body exercise, and mixed training, they actually all significantly improved depressive symptoms in people that were diagnosed with MDD. And weirdly, well, maybe not weirdly, but the effects were surprisingly comparable. There didn't seem to be like this single winner. I was surprised, actually. There wasn't this like one magical modality. So movement itself in multiple forms just really seems to work. The most interesting thing about this wasn't actually really the type of exercise. It was about the dose. So the researchers identified that the U-shaped dose response curve, right? This is important. A U-shape really means that, okay, too little exercise, you're going to get a small effect. A moderate specific dose, the strongest antidepressant response that appears to come. This is what I was particularly interested to find, is that too much exercise, we get diminishing returns. More is not always better, at least we can say that. And so they were really able, from this, to estimate the minimum clinical meaningful dose. In other words, the smallest amount of exercise that reliably starts to move the needle on those depressive symptoms. I want to break that down shortly because those numbers are surprisingly empowering. But the main takeaway from this study is this: you do not need to necessarily train intensely like an athlete to experience a therapeutic benefit. You don't even need super long sessions. We're going to talk about that. There is a very clear, achievable dose of movement that helps clinical depression, and I know that it is probably lower than you are expecting right now. This kind of finding, it changes how we think about exercise as a tool for mental health. It means that, hopefully you don't think of exercise as punishment, but many of us in the fitness space, many coaches, many professionals will talk about fitness in the context of performance, right? Because we're trying to move it away from just being aesthetics-based as well. But this means, with this paper and with this evidence, we can actually start to see it as a physiological and psychological intervention with a very true therapeutic window. It's incredible, actually. It's incredible. Now that we're starting to talk about the dose, we need to introduce a concept that the paper uses. Lots of papers use this, actually. They're called METs, or metabolic equivalents of tasks. So it's a mouthful, let me tell you. But basically, a MET, I'm going to call it a MET from now on, is simply a way of measuring how much energy your body uses during an activity compared to rest. So researchers will set the rest as 1 MET, the amount of oxygen that your body is using when you're just sort of like sitting there, listening to a podcast, doing nothing exciting, right? Actually, that's not a nice way to talk about my podcast, but you know what I mean? It's exciting. Let's say that actually listening to the Vertue Method podcast gives you like a MET of 2. Anyway, now we know that plenty of studies have measured how much oxygen different activities actually require. So now we actually have this enormous database assigning MET values to like all kinds of movements. Like you can look at there's a huge compendium, in fact. Gentle yogas, we're looking at like 2 to 3 METs, right? brisk walking, maybe 3 to 5 METs. Moderate cycling or resistance training, around 6 METs. And running can go anywhere from like 8 to 12 or sometimes even more. Now, where MET, or remember, metabolic equivalence of a task, becomes incredibly useful is really here. It allows us to compare intensity across wildly different exercise types. So 10 minutes of Tai Chi is not the same as 10 minutes of hill sprints, right? That goes without saying, but we're just saying it anyway. 20 minutes of yoga is not going to be the same as 20 minutes of heavy lifting. So METs help us to translate all of these into kind of the same currency. And so because depression research includes so many different modalities, METs are actually quite essential to understand, even when you're reading the research or when you're trying to understand how to think about exercise. So without them, we actually can't really talk about dose in a meaningful way, right? For that fact, if I just said to you, oh yeah, 150 minutes of exercise a week is important. And some people are like, well, is that yoga, or is that a walk, or is that a run, or is that weight training? Like, what is it? So this is where we have to kind of translate it, right? To understand the dose response curve in this study, we need to think in terms of MET minutes, which is simply METs multiplied by time. So we have 30 minutes of walking at 4 METs. That's 120 MET minutes, right? 20 minutes of moderate cycling at 6 METs is 120 MET minutes. Maybe you're doing 40 minutes of Tai Chi and that's only 3 METs. That's going to be 120 minutes. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. And so this is why METs are so clever, because different exercises, we can kind of get an understanding. It means that you can reach this therapeutic dose of exercise through walking, through yoga, through whatever it is that you want to do by simply understanding the minutes and the amount of minutes you would need to do for this. As long as your total weekly MET minutes fall within the therapeutic window that I've spoken about, this removes that pressure to just train hard, right? And takes some of the vagueness out of it. It really opens the door for those of you who are experiencing depression to really choose the movement that feels most achievable. Maybe it's going to be gentle movement, or maybe it's just going to be about being more realistic for your energy levels. And then try to do it for the minutes that are necessary. So that brings me to the next point. How much should we do? What's optimal? What's minimum effective dose? We're going to talk about the numbers because this is the part of the meta-analysis that really matters. So these authors, they identified 2 important thresholds. The minimum effective dose, which was 320 MET minutes per week. And this is the point where the real clinical improvement starts to begin. So what does that really look like? What's 320 MET minutes? So roughly, we're looking at 10 to 15 minutes of moderate movement per day, or 2 30-minute sessions of yoga, or 2 short walks, or maybe a yoga and a walk. Or maybe you've got 3 light strength sessions per week. For people with depression, this is going to be life-changing. It's small enough to feel doable, even when motivation is flat or energy is low. This is the kind of just get moving a little prescription, but it's backed by real clinical data. This is not fluff, just do it a little bit, and get into it. It's no. It is actually going to have a profound effect on your experience of depression. It is going to move the needle here. It is going to reduce those symptoms based on the evidence that we can see from this particular paper, this really important paper that I'm just so grateful to have come across. It also means things like the daily 10 are supported by the evidence in their efficacy, not just for your fitness physiological goals, although it is a physiological goal because depression is physiological as much as it is psychological, but it is also going to impact your mood in a really important way. So if you don't know what the Daily 10 is, head to my YouTube channel, Daily 10 today, and check that bad boy out, because I release videos that are follow along in different ways. So we have strength training follow alongs, we have more circuit training style workouts, I have yoga, I have ab only workouts, but they're all 10 minutes. Sometimes I go over 12 minutes, but they're all short. And so this is exactly what this paper was like. And I wasn't even trying to look for that. I just was reading the paper because so many of you have asked for this topic. But when I came across that finding, I was like, I can't believe that 10 minutes every day could be really effective, like backed by such robust evidence. I mean, I knew the daily 10 was profound just based on people writing to me about it, and obviously my experience, my own experience dealing with grief and baby and the life changes that causes, my experience in coaching people with like, just do 10 minutes. But then to see it in the I'm just like, oh my God, that's it. I quit. I'm done. I'm out of here now. I'm ready. I don't know why I quit, but you know what I mean? It was just like, it was one of those like mic drop moments. Let's swing over to the optimal dose. Optimal dose, 860 MET minutes per week. So this is the sweet spot. Okay, so if you are managing depressive symptoms, this is where the largest improvements are going to occur. What does 860 MET minutes a week look like? That is going to look like 150 to 180 minutes of moderate exercise per week. Or it's going to look like 75 to 90 minutes of vigorous training. Okay, so that might be like quite an intense HIIT workout or quite an intense circuit-based workout or high intensity. And when I say high intensity, I mean like, let's think about maybe a really intense strength training session, depending on the rest periods. Now, it could mean a mix, right? It could be like 3 moderate sessions with daily walking. It could be strength training twice a week and then yoga 1 time a week and then walking. Most importantly, 860 MET minutes is achievable for the vast majority of adults. And the doses above 1100 MET minutes a week didn't actually show any additional benefit in this study. So more isn't necessarily better, okay? It really doesn't apply here, especially in depression, where actually overtraining can worsen fatigue and stress system dysregulation. So that's a really important thing to just take note of. If you have been diagnosed with depression, don't try to like fight your way out of it with exercise or like with loads and loads of exercise. Remember that there is an optimal dose here. And so aiming for that and then thinking about other things that you can do, that's where you start to bring in psychological interventions as well to support you and not deplete from your system. Something that I found particularly interesting is that mind-body has a lower optimal dose. So for yoga, tai chi, qigong, similar practices, the optimal dose was actually around 640 MET minutes per week. And I think this matters because mind-body practices can sometimes feel a little bit more accessible for people if you're dealing with low energy, if you're dealing with chronic fatigue, or if you're dealing with a whole bunch of anxiety, like doing 3 moderate exercise sessions might feel a little bit intense on your physiology. If you're managing, like if MDD has come off the back of a grief experience, like you can't just be like diving into, 70 minutes of high intensity or vigorous exercise, or I wouldn't recommend it. You have to honor that there is a physiological experience we need to kind of relieve as well. And so choosing those mind-body forms are going to be beneficial and you don't have to do as many. The other thing it also means is you just really don't have to train intensely to experience meaningful reductions in depressive symptoms. Let's land this in real life. Okay, here's how I sort of translate the research into actual practice for my clients, for my community, honestly, even for myself. Like during those those initial weeks of my mum passing away, I definitely, and I know I'm not trying to trivialize major depressive disorder, but I can relate to certain times in my life where I have had very deep, dark periods, and it has almost scared me, actually. Coming back to uni and looking on those times, I'm like, okay, yep. Understanding the DSM-5 a little bit better, I'm like, okay. And I know you're not supposed to self-diagnose, but, arrest me. So the first thing I'm going to say is I want you to start with the minimum effective dose, especially if you're in a depressive episode right now. Don't aim for the optimal dose, okay? Aim for the 320 MET minutes per week, which is going to be seen simply as 10 minutes of walking per day. Just try that. Or you could maybe do the daily 10. Or you could do a longer yoga session and maybe a short walk, but blend things in. Okay, don't aim for the most intense session. You can even do 3 tiny strength sessions because the goal is not fitness, not yet. I'm not saying we're not going to go there, but the goal is a metabolic awakening. It's also about this self-efficacy building. I swear I bring up self-efficacy in every single episode. So, some of you, I know, I can feel your eye rolls, but it's so important. We have to feel like we can achieve something for us to continue with the behavior. Okay, so if you don't think that you're going to be able to achieve it, you're not even going to start. And if we start something and we don't actually finish it, we actually chip away at our self-efficacy even more. We chip away at our self-belief. So if you're going out there, particularly in the midst of a really major depressive episode, and you decide, okay, I'm just going to give it a go. I'm just going to try and go hard and whatever. And you use that approach and then you don't succeed, it's going to rattle you more than you think. So we want to build towards the optimal dose very gently. Once we get this is my next point, right? Once we get that consistent minimum effective dose, then we can start to move towards the bigger optimal dose, right? It might eventually start to look like 30 to 40 minute sessions, maybe some daily walking. Maybe it's going to look like strength training twice a week, a little bit of yoga, maybe 2 short, 20-minute cardio bouts. This is the therapeutic zone, okay? And that's really important. Another thing is to choose the modality that feels the least intimidating initially, remembering that all 4 modalities work. You don't need to pick the scientifically best one, actually, because according to the research, they all tend to be really good. If you gravitate towards yoga, go there. If you prefer your strength training, amazing. I love that for you. If walking is all you can manage right now, do that. Consistency is going to be much more important than intensity. However, my little asterisk here is that at some point you are going to benefit from leaning into the unknown and the discomfort. So definitely when you start to feel better from these other modalities that feel easy for you right now, or easier than other ones, go there first and then start to lean towards moving to some of the others, because on a physiological level, beyond the context of depression, we do need strength training. We do need to be making sure that we're doing our cardiovascular training as well. And so if we're just doing yoga because it feels good and it feels nice and it's beautiful and it has this beautiful philosophy, we don't want to also be leaving all the other benefits on the table, which can then come back to bite us later. So we just don't want to get stuck in the yoga or mind body only kind of space. And I say the same to people who only do strength training. I'm like, you just need to be doing your mind body work as well. Okay, that's why I created the Vertue method. What can I say? It was I found that people would always gravitate to one that they loved and then they just get stuck there. And so I was like, well, why don't I just create this method where I'm blending it all together? And that's how the Vertue method was born. It was it's yoga, it's flexibility work, it's also strength work, it is also cardiovascular work, and we bring it all together. What I will say is that for severe depression or very chronic fatigue, mind-body is a very safe entry point. And that's because that optimal dose is lower, right? Because those mind-body sessions, they come with built-in nervous system regulation work. You do the breath work, you do much more interoception building stuff. We need to do a whole episode on that. But anyway, the point is that it's going to nourish you much more. And so that's going to be a little bit more effective than just trying to dive straight into some exercise class because you heard that Shona said that you need to do these certain amounts of training to move the needle on depression. Remember, lower optimal dose for mind, body. That's awesome. Okay, I would also love you to track based on how you feel, not with calories or steps. So if you have depression, it's really important to feel wins and not pressure. And so that means we need to start changing the data or the metric that we're using a little bit. We can't change the data, but we can change the metric and we can change the lens slightly through how we're looking at things. So we're looking at our streaks. We're not looking at the calorie burn we did in a certain workout. Did we meet the workout and did it make us feel good in our body? And we do that for a period of 4 weeks. I actually don't think I told you that the research also said that. Yeah, I don't think I did. So actually, this paper also found that you can start seeing benefits within 4 weeks. That is huge. 4 weeks. That's nothing. Think about how fast this year has gone. So don't forget that. Okay. Now, also remember that U-shaped curve. Okay, so more exercise, not necessarily better. Burnout is not going to heal burnout, right? Depression is not going to respond well to the physiological overwhelm. And then my last tip is once you've done 4 weeks of just hitting consistency on something that you enjoy, then see if you can make sure that the workouts you're choosing are consistent in their approach. Because what we need to do is we need to build on the kind of self-efficacy that we're filling up here. So at some point, the consistency of going for a walk is not going to be enough to make you feel good in that sense, at least in that psychological sense. Physiologically, it will always make you feel good, but sometimes psychologically we need a little bit more. And so that's where I would say, okay, if we're walking great, can we pick a walk that's slightly harder? Can we start to increase the speed of our walk? What are some of the things that we can do to change up to make it that little bit harder, to make it progressive so that we're constantly filling up that self-efficacy? And also we're getting the physiological progression and benefits on that sense as well, because progressive overload is important. Those are my tips. Now, as we wrap this up, I would love you to take from today that depression is complex. I probably don't need to say this, right? Biologically, psychologically, socially even, right? There's no single cure. There's no single tool. There's no universal prescription that's going to work for everyone. But movement appears to be, at the right dose, at the right entry point, one of the few interventions that kind of touches every layer of the human system. Wild. And it's not because it makes you happy. Yeah, with endorphins. It's not because it's like motivational, but because it creates these small physiological openings where possibility can start to return in. It sort of interrupts the stagnation. It shifts your internal chemistry. It shifts your behavioral patterns and your sense of agency in ways that people with depression maybe haven't felt that in a long time, right? The minimum dose is small. And the optimal dose is actually quite achievable, right? There's no singular best exercise. The one that you can stick to is the right one. So if you're listening to this and you're in the thick of it, I want you to know that you don't need to feel good to begin. That's very behavioral activation. You don't even need to feel motivated. You don't need to do it perfectly. You just need one small moment of movement, 10 minutes. A short walk, a little flow, daily 10, repeated with as much kindness and consistency as you can possibly muster. So before we close, I really want to hear from you. So this isn't just a lecture, right? In your own life, if movement has helped your mental health in any way, what do you think the mechanism was? Like, was it something biological? Did it feel emotional? Maybe it was social or behavioral, right? Maybe it's something harder to name, something that felt like it shifted your relationship with yourself, right? Send me a message or leave a comment. Share it with our community, because your experience, it might help someone to feel less alone or to give them the spark that they need to begin. It also means, like I said, that this isn't just a lecture, me lecturing you, but it's actually this two-way communication, and we can actually talk about things and learn from each other. I love learning from my Vertue Crew community. You guys teach me so much every single day in the perspectives that you experience when it comes to training. And so I want that for this podcast. I want you guys to comment your experiences, because we're all going to learn from them. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please make sure that you rate it on Spotify or on Apple, wherever you're listening to it. Give it that 5-star review and share it with someone. You know, maybe there's someone in your life right now that is working that little bit harder, dealing with a little bit more than they want to be. This episode might just be the thing that changes their life, because this paper, I think, is so profound. I just want to get it out there. Thank you so much. I'll see you guys again, or speak to you guys again, or be in your ear holes again next week. Bye.